Okay, JoJo, for the Horde or for the Alliance? Where's he going? Good boy.
Victory for Sylvanas.
Good morning, gamers. Hello. I've had a couple discussions and questions about the difference in global cooldown between Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft. From the WoW side, you have World of Warcraft players asking how Final Fantasy XIV players deal with such a long global cooldown. And from the Final Fantasy XIV side, you have them asking how the WoW players deal with such fast global cooldowns. So I hope to dive into the gameplay of both games and kind of show you guys how each game deals with their respective global cooldowns differently. To start, we need to look at the base global cooldown of both games. For World of Warcraft, the base global cooldown with 0 haste or spell speed for my Final Fantasy friends is 1.5 seconds. And in Final Fantasy XIV, the base global cooldown is 2.5 seconds without any spell speed or skill speed, which is just haste for my WoW friends. So to go about this, I'm going to look specifically at melee classes because that's what I play in both games, although I do play caster in World of Warcraft. But I think melee makes it easy to at least see what's going on because you don't have to worry about cast times and stuff. So the difference between a 2.5 second and a 1.5 second global cooldown is obviously 1 second. But in reality, these variations can be drastically different because of how haste and spell speed or skill speed affect your class playstyle. So please keep in mind that this is a generalization and that this is kind of just looking at it from an overview rather than really diving into the technicalities of both games. For a side-by-side comparison, this is a WoW global cooldown with no haste compared to a Final Fantasy XIV global cooldown with no skill speed. As you can see, at the based haste in World of Warcraft, I'm able to fire about 3 global cooldowns or abilities within the same time frame as using 1 global cooldown in Final Fantasy XIV. So what do Final Fantasy XIV players do in all this downtime between their global cooldowns? Here, let me show you. Okay, memes aside, it's actually the opposite of that. Most classes that I play and enjoy in Final Fantasy XIV go through these loop cycles. And they'll usually go through large burst phases and then kind of calm down for a bit, and they'll go back through another large burst phase and they'll calm down, and they just keep going on and on and on. And something that you're doing during those burst phases is weaving or using off global cooldowns in between your global cooldown timer. So while there is a base 2.5 second global cooldown, the general rule of thumb for these burst classes is that you're going to be using 2 off global cooldowns between each global cooldown, which in addition to the 1 global cooldown that we're using before the following 2 off global cooldowns, would put us at 3 abilities being fired in the same amount of time that you are using 3 abilities in a World of Warcraft rotation. That being in relation to me using 3 abilities in World of Warcraft in the same amount of time of using 1 global cooldown in Final Fantasy XIV. So what I'm getting at is that while Final Fantasy XIV does have a longer global cooldown than World of Warcraft, it also has a lot more off global cooldowns that you have to pay attention to and use in between your global cooldowns, which in turn helps alleviate a lot of the downtime in between each global cooldown. And since the off global cooldowns in Final Fantasy XIV can't just be stacked on top of each other because they have their own internal recast time, you can't just macro these off globals on top of each other and just press 1 button in between each global. So what that means is once you start adding skill speed or spell speed to your class in Final Fantasy XIV, double weaving 2 abilities in between each global becomes much more difficult and dependent upon your ping. And while WoW and Final Fantasy both have rotations and spell priorities and global cooldowns and off global cooldowns and spell queue windows, all these things that they share when it comes to combat, it's still difficult for me to relate the two. Because Final Fantasy XIV's combat for most classes is a dance. You get in a rhythm and you get in a loop and you start learning how to play your class around fight mechanics. dance. And you start optimizing that dance around the fight itself because that dance doesn't have much variation. And that dance is extremely reliant upon you not messing up your rotation. Because with regards to melee, for instance, specifically ninja and samurai, you have a 1, 2, 3 rotation that you're going through every single second. And breaking that combo for mechanics or other global cooldowns that you want to use is devastating. Not only for your DPS, but also your raid's DPS. Because if you mess up, you start misaligning your loop and your dance with the rest of the raid team's buff alignment. And buff alignment, specifically with regards to your burst windows and how those burst windows align with raid buffs, has a much larger presence in Final Fantasy XIV than it does in WoW. And for World of Warcraft, the combat is more priority based. Since you don't have as many offensive global cooldowns in World of Warcraft as you do in Final Fantasy XIV, even though they're adding a few more back in Shadowlands, these offensive global cooldowns don't have their own internal recast time on them. So you can just stack them on top of each other between your fast global cooldowns that you have. So playstyle wise, you're still getting a rhythm and you still have a rotation for your class. But if you take Subtlety Rogue, for example, right now as it is in BFA, you have periods of downtime where you're not casting anything because you're pulling energy for your next burst window. Or you have periods where you're double weaving Shadow Dance and Symbols of Death between a less than 1.5 second global cooldown if you account for haste. So my main point of this video is to show you guys that while Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft are both MMOs and they both are tab target MMOs, while they both have logs, Final Fantasy logs and Warcraft logs, comparing these games is a very difficult thing to do. And WoW players who may be put off of Final Fantasy XIV because of its long global cooldown will hopefully understand that it's a little more complicated than just having a 2.5 second global. Because at the end of the day, they both have different playstyles and they both have different optimization routes. In Final Fantasy, since your rotation is more scripted and the fights are more scripted, you optimize your dance around the fight. And in World of Warcraft, where your rotation is more random and the fight mechanics are more random, you have to learn how to optimize your spells around what you have at the time, alongside of what mechanics are going on at the time. So when people ask me which game's harder to play, which game has harder fights, it's a hard answer. Apples to oranges, right? But as someone who has played both World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy at a high level and at their end game, I can tell you that undermining or shit-talking the other game is a really terrible take. Because whether you like WoW or not, or whether you like Final Fantasy or not, when it comes to end-game optimization and team play, both World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV provide their own route and method to the same goal, which is killing in-game bosses. Do you like having every button that you press having meaning behind it and weight behind it and really affecting the rest of the playstyle for your team? Or do you like sporadicness and not knowing what's coming in a fight and having to adjust what you're doing to what's going on at the time? You never know until you give them both a shot. So what do you think about the combat in Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft? Have you played both games or are you just stuck on one game? I'd love to hear your take on the combat in either one and what you think about the video. The Shadowlands pre-patch hits next week, so I'm super excited about that. I might make a video, but I kind of had an idea for another one that I wanted to do next week. We took JoJo to the vet today and this bread loaf is 14 pounds now. I think he was like 4 pounds when we first got him. But as always, feel free to drop a comment below if there's anything you want to talk about from the video, or feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Discord if there's anything you ever want to talk about. JoJo and I appreciate you taking time out of your day to watch our video, and we hope to see you back next week, and we hope you have a great day. That's it, bye. Goodbye.